EUL's back, baby. So let's go through every single team for what you need to know about EUL this stage. Now, G2, obviously, they've just won the 6 Invitational. So they're absolutely going to be riding the high of that. I put this down as a key strength for them. Their vibes will be good. They'll trust each other. They'll trust the support staff. They'll be going absolutely ham to get into the next major, to, you know, carry on with the majors, carry on with the 6 Invitationals, and establish themselves as a really top team in this league. One of the things that they improved on, actually, during 6 Invitational and the course from Stage 3 all the way to 6 Invitational, was their situation management. When they were getting to the mid-rounds, in their 3v3s, in their 2v2s, they were managing those situations well, converting them into round wins, and then it was going absolutely excellently for them. However, there are a couple of slight causes for concern. One, they're going into a best-of-1 arena now. G2 at the 6 Invitational were playing all best-of-3s, best-of-5s. They've got a massive map pool. They'd clearly worked very, very hard on their map pool. However, going into a best-of-1 arena allows their teams that are against them to really get rid of G2's good maps that they were able to pick into in those best-of-3s, to really force G2 onto those middle ground maps, which, best of ones, they are the great leveler. Also, there is obviously a slight concern. Benjamin is new into that roster. They won the 6 Invitational. Now, they've gone from that honeymoon phase, they're now into that kind of grind phase. And we've seen teams, once they've got over the honeymoon phase, they've gone into the grind phase and they've really struggled to actually keep those standards high. So that's a big question mark at the minute about G2 is, can they continue those high standards they set for themselves through the 6 Invitational, carry it into EUL Stage 1? If they can, they're going to be absolutely one of the top rosters, but they might start hitting a couple of speed bumps by just being in the day-to-day grind with this new roster. What I will say though, just to counter my own point a little bit, is they only changed out one player. They only brought in Benja, and that hasn't changed the dynamic of the team too much. The rest of these players for, you know, a long time now have been together in that grind phase. So I don't think it's much of a concern, but there is still a very, very small question mark in my mind. Moving through to BDS. Of course, they're going to be one of the best teams in the competition. Now, that is primarily related to the fact that they've got Shaiko and Leakifak, both absolute goats, both absolute fraggers in their own right. Even though they play slightly different roles, they are both game winners for BDS. And I think that makes them a very, very strong opponent. We've seen them be consistently good across EUL 2020, 2021, 2022, and we expect them to be consistently good in 2023. They're a very balanced roster, and they're also a very good best-of-1 team. They do their homework, they do the preparations, they get their map bans right, they get their operator bans right, and they execute good plans. BDS are very good on like 8 maps, right? So when I talk about teams and their map pools, in best of ones, you're not going to be able to achieve your best maps. So you've got to be really good at your middle ground preference maps, and that's what BDS are. They've got a consistent level across all of their maps, and that makes them a very deadly best of 1 team. Now, for my concerns around them, is there a reliance on Shaiko and Efak? You would argue probably yes. We do see players every now and again, you know, every now and again Renshu will come in with a big game. Every now and again Alems comes in with a big game. The same with Brede. You know, even in 2022 when BDS won the major, Brede was looking like his 2020 self, where he was absolutely fragging, he was planting, he was clutching, he was doing everything. That kind of fell off going into 6 Invitational, to the point where it shows that there's maybe a reliance on 2 players, which I'll grant them, it is better than when they just relied on Shaiko. But, you know, you kind of start to wonder, if there's a reliance on 2 players and those players don't turn up, what have BDS got? That actually then brings me into my next point, is that BDS haven't made a roster change, and you can see this as a good or a bad thing. However, Deadshot was available, Blaz was available. They're both on separate EUL rosters. Both are French, both are native, obviously French speakers, and could slot into BDS. Now, that maybe, had either of those players have gone to BDS, addressed the fact that there's a reliance on Shaiko and Efak. That maybe would have, you know, quashed that particular concern. So BDS not making a roster change is potentially a concern for me when there are other great French players, you know, available. If you look at the French players that have come on to either Wolves or, you know, in the Wylde, in the heroic case for Blaz, you know, BDS have missed out on a lot of these French protégés now for sticking together in that brotherhood. At times it's a key strength, but I wonder if it's a little bit too stubborn to have stuck with it. Moving through to MNM. Now, MNM realistically are a big not even a dark horse, a favourite for me in this EUL competition. I think they had a successful Invitational overall. I know that they're going to be very, very upset with how they ended Invitational going out at the point that they did. But the fact they had such a successful group stage and they took it all the way, and even on the day that they got knocked out, they really could have won. That's really good for this roster. And just take a step back. 12 months ago, we were talking about MNM as the new kids on the block in EUL. They had just played their 6th Invitational, which they qualified for in Challenger League, but they, you know, it was all about getting that experience, getting the LAN events. They attended, what, 2 LAN events, and then they've had 2 Invitationals since they came into Tier 1. That's really good. The overall 12 months, you know, 13 months if we include last year's Invitational, has been really, really good for MNM. They've now brought Nath in, and it looks like he has good ideas. He's very vocal. I got the pleasure of actually standing and just watching MNM in person. He's a very vocal player, and I think he's going to be key to their success in EUL. Now, the one thing I haven't talked about yet for G2, for MNM, is that they've brought in Julio. They've brought in an experienced player and coach. An experienced player to the point he's just played in the last 6 Invitational Grand Final, merely, what, 3-4 weeks ago? So they've brought in Julio. He's going to bring them a lot of experience. He might even bring them a little bit of Brazilian flair. So we might see a little bit of a changed MNM with regards to strats, with regards to team play. And I think that's only going to be a good thing. Now, for this video, I tried to find 2 negatives for each team. I could only find 1 for MNM. When I really looked through it and I really thought in my heart of hearts, what negatives, what concerns could I find? And the only one that I could think of is that best of ones really isn't their strong suit. And it's kind of the same reasoning as what I said with G2, which is they've got some really, really strong maps. Some really, their top 3-4 preference are all great maps. However, they won't get to play a lot of them in this best of 1 arena. They're going to be stuck on their kind of 4th, 5th, 6th preference maps a lot of the time, depending on their opponent, of course, and, you know, who's silly enough to take them to Skyscraper or whatever else. So that's the one thing for me, is best of 1s might not suit them as well as best of 3s did. We saw them be unreal in best of 3s during the 6th Invitational. Now, going back into the best of 1 arena, the dynamic completely changes. Moving through to Heroic, we've seen a couple of players change out for Heroic, and we've now gone through and we've seen that they've retained Uno, they've retained Joom, and that's it. They've brought in Blaz, they've brought in Kayak, they've brought in Skiddy. It's all changed, even from the 6th Invitational roster that included Noodle. He's now gone elsewhere, he's gone over to Koi. So I think for Heroic, the one good thing that I will say is that they've got 3 incredibly talented frontline players. Joom, Blaz, Skiddy actually scares me as how good those 3 players could be. They're all somewhat proven now inside of Tier 1 EUL. We saw Blaz in NAL literally carrying his team, you know, in terms of the kills, got so many kills every single game. He was an absolute demon over in the North American scene. Now, they've added in Skiddy, who was unreal from Na'Vi, and they've retained Joom, whom we know how good Joom can be as well. So that front 3 is absolutely full of match winners. Add into that the fact that they've got Kayak and Uno, which is a very experienced backline. You know, both former G2, obviously. They've been around the scene a long time now, both of these guys. Especially Uno. That's a really experienced backline that can help guide this front line who, you know, are still quite young, are still quite relatively inexperienced in the scene, can help guide them around the map, you know, and keep their experience, let that flow through, and guide them to victory, basically, is what I'm trying to say. So Heroic seem that they've got a lot of balance from that point of view. They've also got a nice team composition with regards to 3 frontline players, 2 backline players. It seems very good. My concerns for Heroic are a couple of things. One of them is that, do they talk enough? Now, Joom is known as a very, very quiet person in the server. Blaz is known as the same, especially because he'll be communicating in English rather than his native language of French. So your 2 primary entry players, Blaz and Joom, are going to be kind of a lot more quieter than you would expect, which makes me wonder how well the team play is going to work out between this team. Obviously, Skiddy is native English, so I think if Skiddy can step it up with the communication department of that front line, then they should be okay. But there's a slight concern here that the front line isn't as vocal as it maybe should be. Now, the second concern is, does the back line have enough power? Now, we've seen that Kayak has some great ideas for Siege. You know, when he played in the Na'Vi in his previous kind of year and a half, there's been some really, really good Siege play, and I put that at, you know, he's responsible for a lot of that, the ideas around how the game should be played. Uno is kind of the same. They're both very experienced, and I think that's a key strength. However, typically both of those players have gone negative over the, you know, the last few stages and tournaments that they've played. So if the push comes to shove and Blaz and Jumon, Skiddy, or, you know, 2 of those 3 players are having an off day, can Kayak, can Uno step it up? That's the kind of concern there. They're not the backline players, you know, for example, like a Bride that's fragging the hell out, like a Virtue, like a Leon Gibbs, like a Deepak. In terms of the numbers performances, they're not necessarily as statistically strong there, so that is a very slight concern. Moving through to Koi. Now, Koi's a strange one, but we'll start with their positives. They've brought in 2 good players with a lot of upside potential. Noodle and Leader are both highly coveted players in terms of this year's EUL. Obviously, Leader was free after the Na'Vi roster got sold over to Wylde, and Noodle was on a short-term contract with Heroic. So both players were free, and Koi have looked and, you know, they've picked them up. Obviously, that was minus Kanto and minus Spoit, and we'll go into that in a little bit more detail. But let's just focus about the 2 players that they have brought in. I think Noodle obviously had a little bit of experience in the Mexican Siege, had a little bit of experience at 6 Invitational, and he really stepped up at 6 Invitational. He put in a very, very good performance for a Heroic roster that was put together at very last minute, especially with Sloth, you know, joining that Heroic roster just mere days before their first game. So I think he's a very good player with a lot of potential, and I think he can absolutely thrive at Koi. For Leader, he came into Na'Vi and he hit the ground running. And I think this is a big upgrade for him in terms of going to Koi, but he's got a very wise head on his shoulders. He plays very smart Siege, and he also can frag out. He is unflappable in those clutch situations. So that's very, very good for Koi. I think they've got a lot of potential. They also had, if you look at it, a relatively good Invitational. Now, not as good as they wanted, don't get me wrong. The expectations for Koi themselves was win the Invitational. But to get top 6, especially given, to be honest, some of the Siege they played in group stage was not the best Siege at all. The fact that they even got to top 6 for me was really good, you know, output and a really good performance. And I think it's definitely something that they can build towards. They won a major and they got top 6 at the Invitational. In their eyes, they should have gone to all 3 majors. Obviously, they did win one and they should have won Invitational. But that's a whole different story about an expectations gap there. Now, moving through to the concerns for Koi. Losing Spoit is obviously a massive loss for them. They obviously didn't get a lot of say in it. He wasn't kicked, you know, it's unfortunate they've lost him. They didn't want it to happen. They've got to move through. But Spoit is a star player. Spoit is probably one of the top 5 players in the world. Also, his commercial kind of viability in terms of the interest around the team. He is one of the biggest content creators. He is one of the biggest names in Rainbow Six in its totality. So losing Spoit for Koi is absolutely massive, and that will have hurt a lot. Now, that is a concern, but they can turn it into a positive, because there'll be a lot of people writing Koi off now that Spoit has left them. There'll be a lot of people not wanting to cheer for Koi now Spoit has left them. So they need to have this bit between their teeth and just really go for it. Now, the second concern for me is actually a bit more transactional, is they've replaced, if you look at it, Kanto and Spoit, who were the two of the 3 fraggers in Koi, and they've replaced them with Noodle and Leader. Noodle is, you know, played a bit of kind of lurk and frag with Heroic and is a frontline player, don't get me wrong, but then also they've replaced them with Leader, who is known as a backline player. With Na'Vi, he played a lot of the backline. He played a lot of kind of second support and support oriented players. So with Koi, who, you know, established the meta of this kind of 3 frontline players, 2 backline players, and now playing with 2 frontline and 3 backline, someone's got to step up into the front line. Now, Leader can do that, Deepak can do that, Leon can do that. And it is a bit of a concern, because I wouldn't want to take Deepak out of a support role because he is so goddamn good at it. I wouldn't want to take Leon out of an IGL role because he is so goddamn good at it, and it's the fabric of Koi's identity. However, somebody needs to make a step up. Now, where Koi have an opportunity, because every weakness presents an opportunity, where Koi have the opportunity is actually they can fluidly integrate all 3 of those backline players into the front line in different maps, different strats, and it actually makes them a much more dynamic team in totality. So we'll see, and we'll keep an eye on how that one in particular goes. Moving through to Secret. Now, Secret, big positive is this Brazilian effect they've got going on. They qualified to the 6 Invitational. They've got more time with Twister. It looks like they're going to play much more of a Brazilian LATAM style play of Siege, rather than a kind of old, slow, plant-focused Siege that they're used to. If they can keep building on that and become a kind of Brazilian identity, we can start thinking about Secret in the context of M80, when Bodega went to, you know, Xset, or now M80, when Bodega went there and transformed how they thought about the game, how they played the game. If Secret can continue doing that, they could have their own brand, their own identity, and they could look really good whilst doing so. They obviously had their first LAN bootcamp and they played the Six Invitational. Now, it didn't go as well as they would have wanted it to go, but overall, for Team Secret that was in, you know, the bottom 2 of every single stage of 2022, that's still a good outcome and a good achievement, and they should be riding the high that comes off the back of that. Now, here's the concerns. Kendra's left, so, you know, who's coming in to replace? It's not officially announced as at the point of this video. Hello, Secret, announce, please. Anyway, who's the IGL now? That, I guess, is my big question. Who's the IGL now? How are they going to play? Because Kendra was at the heart and soul of everything in terms of leading that team on Team Secret. So who's going to take over that responsibility? Are we going to see players playing out of position? And that brings me to my second point. What does the team composition look like? How are these players going to slot into a system? Is it going to be 3 frontline, 2 backline? At the point of officially not knowing who's on that roster, we don't actually know what the team composition looks like, and is it going to be metagame? So there's a few question marks hanging over Secret, but I think, you know, if I was looking at Secret across this year, I would be quietly excited about how they could be going in terms of the way that they're going to play, the people that they've brought in. There's a little bit of quiet excitement going on in the Team Secret camp right now. Going on to TT9 now. The roster that TT9 have got is obviously, they've brought it in, they've replaced the Russian roster, and they've gone for Kendrew, Gisela, Noah, Prano, Kanto. Now, 2 good things about this roster. 1, they've got the experience blended with the potential. They've got the experience of Kendrew, who's been around forever. Pro League winner, Tokonami. They've got the experience of Prano, who has been around forever. Team Secret, Rogue, G2, you know, he's been all over the place. He's been in EUL, and they've got the experience of Kanto. You know, I talked about Kendrew as a Pro League winner, doesn't matter. Kanto's won Invitationals, mate. So, you know, he's won Invitationals, he's won Majors. So they've got a lot of experience in TT9, and they've blended it with a decent amount of potential with both Noah and Gisela. I think particularly Gisela's looking at, you know, being one of those German players who would have been in Pro League a year ago if there was a German roster, but, you know, there wasn't necessarily. So he's finally getting an overdue chance, but that's a good blend of experience and potential there for TT9. The roster also, compositionally wise, seems balanced on paper. You've got Kendrew, you've got Prano. I would expect those 2 to be the backline players. You've got Noah, you've got Kanto. I'd expect those to be the frontline players. And then Gisela just in the middle as a kind of flex. He can go to the frontline or the backline, depending on what the map is, the situation is, whatever's needed. So the balance on paper and the balance of experience and potential seems really, really good. Now, here's the context. This team is kind of I don't want to be too disrespectful, but it feels like kind of put together. It's not a natural team on paper. We're not looking at a people that's friends groups that, you know, goes way back. We've got 2 Germans, a Swede, a Finn, and an English player that, you know, Kendrew, in terms of being the English player, was on Team Secret 3 weeks ago. Kanto was on Koi, a week and a half ago it was announced and he was told that he was leaving. This team has been very much put together at very last minute. So that's a slight concern, is that they're not going to fit in as a team right now, and it will take time for those guys to gel and become a coherent unit. Now, the second, you know, question mark for my mind is how long before role changes? Because if this team happens, and if this team does struggle, which an expectation is that this team might struggle because they're going into EUL, they've not had much time together. If they struggle, we saw this on Team Secret with a Prano-led roster, where when he felt that his frontline weren't getting enough kills, he kind of went and lurked and played on Sophia and just lurked around the map and found kills. And he did it very successfully, mind. So if Prano starts off on support, but then his team aren't getting the entire kills, how long before there's role changes within this roster? And that's the question mark for me is, you know, will it be a stable roster or not? I don't yet know, basically. Moving through to Virtus Pro, and we can call them Virtus Pro now, which has been, you know, a long time coming, to be fair. They've got a lot of time back together as a full 5. I say a full 5. You know, always Dan Joystick Shepherd. We've seen them in invitational finals. This has been a core for a long, long time. They're finally going to be back in EUL, and we need to celebrate that. The fact that they've had some time together now, scrimming, playing under the Virtus Pro brand. They've obviously added Pasha into the lineup as well. I think that's a real positive for them. You know, they are a good quality outfit. They've got good quality players. And that's one huge benefit for them. They are also hugely experienced in terms of their players. Nothing will phase them in terms of playing EUL or, you know, the new format or best of ones or best of threes or whatever. They've seen it all. They've done it all. They're not going to be bothered by that one bit. Now, here's the concerns for this roster. Old meta Siege. Can they update? Can they work their way out of it? Because when we saw them playing in the qualifiers, it became very apparent that the teams that play to either disrupt Virtus.pro really early on, spawn peek them, get aggressive, get in their faces, play the team play, or conversely, give them all the ground they want, but reinforce the site on the defense and really play time and denial operators, then that's where I start worrying, because if Virtus.pro can't get out of that old kind of meta mindset, then they may well struggle, because I feel every single EUL team will have seen their weak points, will have seen how they can struggle against the new meta, and will really force it against them. So for me, it's going to be very interesting to see Virtus.pro play on their very first play day, how they play. Can they adapt to the new brand of Siege that's being played almost across the world now? Now, the second thing is obviously they're playing from Russia, they're playing on ping. And this has always been an age-old problem. It will still always be an age-old problem. They've said that the ping, causes them to slow down, causes them in part to play the way that they do, and how they can deal with that. Now, they've dealt with this kind of concern or worry, for the best part of 2 or 3 years, to the point it's not really a concern or worry. However, it is something to point out for this team. It is a subconscious thing for them that is an inherent disadvantage for them, is that they're playing on the ping, it causes them to slow down, and that builds into their brand of old meta Siege. Wolves. Now, Wolves have got Deadshot. They've added him. Now, Deadshot was a highly coveted player coming out of France. He's been known in and around the tier 3, the EUCL scene for a long time now, and he's been known as a good, very, very, very good, very strong player that on his day is absolutely unbelievable. Now, Wolves have done very well to get him, because there was opportunities where he could have gone into a roster like BDS and done excellently, the same as League Effect did. So Wolves have got him, and I think that's a great transfer for Wolves. I think they've added a player that can bring a lot of frag power, a lot of confidence to the team, and really help develop this team to establish themselves as a top team. If you look at Wolves as well, they've had a very successful 2022 all in all, because if you look at where we hit Wolves when they were Vitality at the end of 2021, they were this team that I said that they were the also-rans. They were the team that came in the competition and they also played the competition. Maybe they got, top 4 at a push, but they were the 5th, 6th, 7th place team consistently. It was Wolves and it was Virtus.pro at the time. Now, Wolves have actually had a very, very good 2022. Top 4 every single stage. They went to the Invitational. Now, sure, the actual LAN events didn't go as well as expected, but if you look at the overall picture, very successful roster for this year, and that's the building blocks that they can keep building on. And I think that's what they're trying to do, especially with this transfer of adding in Deadshot. Now, was the replacement of Rise the right decision? Because this is a question mark. Now, Rise, people will say, has not put in some good statistical performances across the year, and that's true. And they will say that adding in Deadshot and minus Rise is great, but what we're discounting here is Rise's agiling, Rise's calling, Rise's communication, Rise forcing the team play of Wolves that made them so good during the league and online play, especially when there are other players that have performed statistically worse than Rise and haven't added enough with regards to the experience and forcing the team play and the communication. It's a wonder whether removing Rise for adding Deadshot was the right decision, and whether they maybe should have looked at a different player. I don't know. I'm not on the internals of that team, so it's one of those things that is a question mark in my mind, because it's now a very, very young roster with a lack of experience realistically. Obviously, P4 and Shinka have had a decent amount of experience now. They've attended, 5 LAN events with Vitality/Wolves. Mowgli's kind of similar as well. Abibu has been around since day dot, but they are replacing experience and adding in inexperience with 3 relatively inexperienced players. Now, I mentioned the performances of, every single player. I think Wolves, there's a question mark around individual consistency. We will see so many times one player pop off one game, then have a bad game, pop off, bad game, pop off, bad game. And it happens so much that they can't find it seems from the outside that they struggle to find a nice baseline with some of their key players in the team. And I think that's a concern for me. I think in 2023, I want to see some of these players, Mowgli, P4, finding this baseline consistency that Wolves can then build off of. Moving through to Wylde, the very last roster in EUL. Now, Wylde obviously took the Na'Vi spot in terms of EUL, and they retained Teb. Now, the thing is with Wylde is that this roster was put together very, very last minute because all of this happened very, very last minute. However, let's go through the positives. They have got some individually talented players that are absolutely pop-off match winners. For example, they've got aces, they've got jegs, they've got hungry, they've got people who can all make things happen in a round, especially when they're not necessarily strategically winning that round. So that excites me, you know, seeing jegs in EUL is something that I believe is long overdue. We saw a glimpse of him in the SI quals when he played it with Na'Vi. He obviously didn't do too well playing up against the tier 1 teams, so we'll have to see how he goes, but he's got over that bump now. He's made his essential tier 1 debut, and he's now making an EUL debut going into it today. They've also brought in the experienced players. They've got Packball on that roster, they've got aces, they've got hungry, so they've got players with a lot of experience, especially over EUL, but internationally as well. So it's looking decent. They've got individually, they've got talent, they've got experience, they just need to find a way to mesh it together and make it work. Now, that's where the concern starts. This is a very new roster. They very likely don't have the synergy. They very likely aren't meshed together, aren't gelled together, haven't found out, you know, the full ins and outs of working as a team together yet. So that is definitely a concern, that there will be miscommunications, there will be misplays, there will be misfires. And that's part and parcel of the team being so new together. And that's what, you know, the fans of Wylde are just going to have to basically sit through and go for, basically. Now, also, there's a slight concern around the brand of Siege, because when you add in a player such as Hungry, you play quite, I would say, an exotic brand of Siege. Now, there's a lot of players, and I'm not just talking about like Ying and stuff, there's a lot of players that just play Ying now, which is what Hungry is known for. But it's quite a unique brand of Siege, when Hungry has a lot of ideas about how the game should be played. And we see them, and people love them. It's great. However, to do that, you need a very solid foundation to build your team off of to then enable that. And that's where I worry for Wylde at the minute, is that they don't necessarily have that foundation. So it might look like it's just what the hell is going on in a few of their rounds and a few of their games. And it's just for them just about pulling through it and making sure they're working as hard as they can right now to bring it all together, to find that foundation and find that basis. And then they can start looking at how to, you know, go through and create these exotic plays and these elaborate plays. And that's the video. That should wrap up everything you should need to know. Strengths, concerns, weaknesses, roster moves, absolutely everything about EUL. And I'm looking forward to seeing you on the broadcast very soon.